Alexander Vasilyevich Sergeychik gained notoriety as a Belarusian serial killer who struck fear in the Shchuchyn and Grodno districts between 2000 and 2006. During his reign of terror, Sergeychik confessed to the gruesome murders of 12 individuals. However, the prosecution could only amass enough evidence to secure his conviction for 6 of these heinous crimes. As a result, he faced the ultimate penalty, receiving a death sentence from the court. His case serves as a chilling reminder of the darkness that can lurk in even the most unsuspecting places. Before we continue, I would like to announce a giveaway for a 1-year plan of Curiosity Stream. The link will be in the description down below, and it's the best I can do for now. However, I plan on creating new giveaways in the near future as well. I really appreciate all the support, and this is a small gesture of my gratitude for all of you, dear viewers. The giveaway will be open for a while so that everyone can catch up with the application. If you enjoy this type of content, don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already, and give this video a like if you enjoyed it. Also, please reach out to me in the comments down below. Subscriptions and comments will count as one manual entry as well. Let's continue with our video now, shall we? Alexander Vasilyevich Sergeychik's troubled early life cast a shadow over his future. Born in 1970 in Semyonovka village, Byarostovica district, BSSR, he grew up in a large family alongside a brother and a sister. His father, an alcoholic prone to violence, subjected Sergeychik, his mother, and siblings to regular abuse before abandoning them for another woman. Despite these challenging circumstances, Sergeychik managed to complete his education, graduating from Makarovskaya Secondary School. He then pursued vocational training to become a driver. In the late 1980s, he served in the armed forces of the USSR from 1989 to 1991, before being demobilized in November 1991. Following his military service, he returned to his native village and found work as a driver for a local enterprise. A turning point in Sergeychik's life came in March 1992, when he spotted a recruitment announcement for the police force. He decided to apply for a position and successfully gained entry. Sergeychik excelled in his law enforcement career, graduating with honors from the Ministry of the Interior Academy of the Republic of Belarus. During this time, he married and started a family, eventually becoming the father of 2 children. Within the police force, Sergeychik rose through the ranks, eventually becoming a company commander. Colleagues described him as a responsible and executive worker. However, beneath his seemingly ordinary exterior, a sinister darkness lurked, as evidenced by his later reign of terror as a serial killer. Sergeychik's criminal history is marked by a disturbing series of events that unfolded over the years. It all began on September 18, 1992, when he committed his first crime by stealing a trailer from the Oktyabr collective farm. This initial act of theft set the stage for a lengthy criminal career that included breaking into garages, stealing cars, and various other properties. Among his stolen items were a carbine, a Walter PP pistol, and several dummy grenades. Over a period of 14 years, Sergeychik managed to accumulate stolen property with an estimated value of $900,000. In April 2000, Sergeychik escalated his criminal activities by committing his first murder. His victim was 21-year-old Helen Boltok, whom he had picked up as a traveling companion. They journeyed 76 kilometers into the Shchuchyn district forest, where Sergeychik had premeditatedly prepared a bottle of alcohol. After engaging in sexual intercourse, a horrifying turn of events followed as he strangled her, doused her lifeless body with gasoline, and set her on fire, all while robbing her of her jewelry and cash. June of the same year witnessed another gruesome act by Sergeychik. He entered the apartment of his 31-year-old mistress, Svetlana Pirskaya, following a heated dispute about divorcing his wife. Fueled by anger and under the influence of alcohol, he strangled her with a TV cable and then staged her hanging in the bathroom. He proceeded to seize any available cash from the apartment. In late July 2000, Sergeychik became acquainted with 19-year-old Lyudmila Kodik. Under the false pretense of visiting the Neman River, they consumed alcohol together. However, the encounter turned violent as he severely beat her, strangled her with a premeditated rope, and discarded her lifeless body into the river. Following this brutal act, Sergeychik robbed her and burglarized her apartment. In 2001, Sergeychik assaulted several detainees who had been arrested for public intoxication. His next murders occurred in September 2002, and he had an accomplice, his 18-year-old nephew, Dmitry Barkov. They embarked on a horrifying journey, searching for victims in Grodno, but initially failing to find one. Eventually, they ventured out of town and came across a parked Vaz 2106 Jiguli near the roadside. Armed with Alexander's pistol, Sergeychik approached the car and knocked on the driver's door, presenting his service certificate while demanding the car keys. When the driver, Viktor Syritsia, refused, Sergeychik shot him in the head through the windshield, though Syritsia miraculously survived. Sergeychik and Barkov then dragged Syritsia out of the car and beat him to death. In the same car was Syritsia's girlfriend, Elena Turchenik, who tried to escape but was caught by Barkov. She endured a horrifying ordeal as they took turns assaulting her before Sergeychik ultimately strangled her with a towing cable. The criminals robbed their victims, tied their lifeless bodies with a towing cable, and left them in the car trunk. In November 2003, while on duty, Sergeychik assaulted a detainee at his workplace and deployed a gas canister, which necessitated calling for an ambulance. Tragically, this case was overlooked. In February 2006, Sergeychik, in a state of intoxication and following a dispute with his wife, visited his friend's mistress, Natalia Bazis. Earlier, he had consumed alcohol with his friend at her apartment. Several hours later, Sergeychik returned to the apartment, where he subjected Bazis to a brutal assault, including sexual assault and strangulation with her bra. Her lifeless body was left in the bathroom as Sergeychik proceeded to burglarize the apartment before fleeing the scene. These events paint a grim picture of Sergeychik's criminal activities, characterized by a relentless and violent pattern of behavior that caused immeasurable suffering and tragedy for his victims. Following the heinous murder of Natalia Bazis, a series of events would lead to the apprehension and trial of Alexander Sergeychik. His descent into darkness was about to be unveiled. After the murder of Bazis, investigators turned their attention to her circle of friends, including Sergeychik. Despite having resigned from the police force by that time, his fingerprints were discovered on fragments of a bottle that had been used in the fatal assault on Bazis. Initially, Sergeychik attempted to distance himself from the murder, but as he provided testimony, he grew increasingly perplexed and fell under suspicion. A search of his apartment and garages yielded a shocking discovery: items stolen from Lyudmila Kodik's apartment, as well as an arsenal of weapons and other stolen property. In February 2006, the former law enforcement officer found himself charged with 2 murders and associated robberies, leading to his imprisonment. However, this was only the beginning. As the investigation deepened, Sergeychik faced additional charges for 4 more murders, with his DNA evidence linking him to the crime scenes. Under mounting pressure, Sergeychik eventually began to confess, admitting to the gruesome murders of 11 women and 1 man. Shockingly, he detailed how his victims were subjected to sexual assault and murder before being either burned or discarded into the Niemen River. Tragically, the bodies of these victims were never recovered, preventing formal charges for these crimes. Psychiatrists evaluated Sergeychik's mental state and determined that he was legally sane, further cementing the severity of his actions. The trial of Alexander Sergeychik and his accomplice, Dmitry Barkov, commenced on February 20, 2007, within a closed court session. Sergeychik faced a litany of charges, including murder with special cruelty to conceal another crime from hooligan motives, sexual assault, theft of property, including firearms, and various charges related to the illegal possession, carrying, storage, transportation of firearms, ammunition, explosives, and explosive devices. Ultimately, on May 22, 2007, Sergeychik was found guilty of all charges and was sentenced to the most severe penalty, execution, with the confiscation of all his property by the Grodno District Court. In contrast, Dmitry Barkov received a 10-year sentence in a penal colony for his involvement in the crimes. The Supreme Court of the Republic of Belarus upheld the verdict without alteration. On November 26, 2007, the verdict was carried out, marking the end of a harrowing chapter in Belarusian history as justice was served, and the reign of a ruthless serial killer came to a close. Sergeychik's arrest sent shockwaves throughout the law enforcement community, sparking a scandal that would have far-reaching consequences. On October 28, 2007, President Alexander Lukashenko took decisive action by signing Decree No. 540, titled, "On Incomplete Service Compliance." This decree aimed to address the serious violations of lawfulness and inaction that had occurred in connection with the case. According to the Prosecutor General of Belarus, Peter Miklaszewicz, it became evident that numerous individuals within the Ministry of Internal Affairs and the Prosecutor's Office needed to be held accountable for their role in these grievous oversights. In response to these revelations, a significant number of employees from the Ministry of Internal Affairs and the Prosecutor's Office were subjected to disciplinary measures, ranging from the highest levels down to regional and district officials. The consequences were far-reaching. The first deputy head of the Ministry of Internal Affairs RB, Alexander Sergeychik, received a warning as a result of his involvement in the matter. Reprimands were issued to several high-ranking officials, including State Secretary of the Security Council Viktor Shaiman, Interior Minister Vladimir Naumov, and his deputies Viktor Filistovich and Viktor Zhyburtovich. The Deputy Prosecutor General, Stepan Kosucha, and Viktor Prus were also reprimanded. Strict reprimands were handed down to individuals such as the former head of the Internal Affairs Directorate of the Grodno Oblast Executive Committee, Anatoly Belashevsky, the former first deputy head of the Internal Affairs Directorate, Viktor Zherebelo, as well as the former heads of the Grodno Regional Administration of the Okhrana Association under MVD, Vladimir Pekarsky, and Ivan Zmurshchik. The former First Deputy Minister of Internal Affairs, Mikhail Udovikov, faced severe consequences as he was stripped of his firearms privileges. In addition to these personnel actions, on October 31, 2007, a further shakeup occurred within the prosecutorial ranks. The prosecutor of the Grodno region, Vasily Litvinov, his deputy, Vladimir Onisko, and the prosecutor of the Oktyabrski district of the city of Grodno, Boris Taranko, were relieved of their posts. The fallout from Sergeychik's arrest and the subsequent investigation underscored the gravity of the lapses within the Ministry of Internal Affairs and the Prosecutor's Office, leading to significant disciplinary actions and restructuring within these institutions. Thank you all who stick until the end of the video. I would like to remind you to enter the giveaway. Leave a like, subscribe if you are new, and leave a super thanks if you are feeling generous. I am Alex, and this is Conundrum. Stay curious and stay safe. Vladimir Georgievich Vinichevsky, also known as the Uals monster, holds the grim distinction of being the youngest Soviet serial killer. Between 1938 and 1939, he committed 18 horrifying attacks on children aged 2 to 4 years old in Sverdlovsk, Nizhny Tagil, and Kushva, with 8 of these attacks ending in tragedy. His reign of terror came to an end when he was sentenced to death on the 16th of January 1940, and he was executed just a few months later. Vladimir Vinichevsky, born in July 1923, came from a relatively well-off family in Sverdlovsk, Soviet Russia. His father, Georgy Ivanovich, held a position as a crew chief in municipal public utilities, while his mother, Elizaveta Petrovna, worked as an accountant. The family lived in a standalone private house in the city center, and by Soviet standards of the time, they were considered prosperous. Young Vladimir had possessions like a suit, a tank helmet, a Swiss knife, and leather shoes. He even had pocket money, amassing more than 20 rubles, equivalent to 2 days' salary for an average Soviet worker. Vinichevsky attended Sverdlovsk School, number 16, initially in the 7th grade. Due to his academic struggles, he had to repeat a grade at one point. However, He possessed a talent for singing and knew many songs by heart. During his formative years, Wieniawski formed a friendship with Ernst Nieświętny, who would later become a renowned sculptor. Despite being 2 years older than Nieświętny, Wieniawski attended school at an older age and repeated a grade, placing them in the same school year. They lived near each other and enjoyed shared activities such as going to school, watching movies, and attending Sverdlovsk's Theater of Musical Comedy. Wieniawski frequently visited Nieświętny's apartment. Nieświętny described Wieniawski as a very reserved and introverted boy who preferred solitude. In school, he often stood in a corner or by the wall. When discussing girls, Wieniawski expressed a strong aversion to sexual intercourse and claimed never to have engaged in it. Nieświętny also noticed that Wieniawski spent an unusually long time in the restroom, though he remained unaware of his activities there. Wieniawski's acts of violence were primarily centered in Sverdlovsk, but he deliberately extended his reach to other cities within the Sverdlovsk Oblast in an effort to confound investigators. Notably, one attack occurred in Nizhny Tagil, and another took place in Kushva. His victims spanned both genders, and the driving force behind these attacks was sexual in nature. Initially, Wieniawski attempted to engage in what he considered natural acts with female victims, but he soon realized that anatomical constraints made this impossible. The murder of Gerda Gribanova provided crucial evidence for investigators, as a piece of the knife used was lodged in the girl's skull. Authorities removed her head for examination, retaining the skull as evidence, while the rest of her remains were returned to her parents for burial. Initially, it was assumed that the same kitchen knife had been used in subsequent crimes, but this assumption was later proven false. The fifth victim, a young boy who likely survived but remained unaccounted for, experienced a harrowing encounter. Wieniawski proposed that 4-year-old Borya Titov accompany him for sledding, but instead, he led the child to a desolate area and subjected him to harm. Fortunately, the child was rescued and subsequently cooperated with investigators to identify his attacker. The seventh victim was 3-year-old Kate Lobanova in Kushva, who tragically lost her life. Her body was later disposed of in a swamp to mask the signs of decomposition. In Sverdlovsk, Wieniawski altered his approach by abducting children and committing violence in forested areas on the city's outskirts. There, he concealed their bodies beneath branches. This is how 4-year-old Lida Surina and 3-year-old Valya Kamaeva met their tragic fates in the spring of 1939. Subsequently, 3-year-old Alia Gubina was kidnapped and subjected to assault by Wieniawski. Afterward, he inflicted multiple knife wounds on her, including a 25-centimeter-long wound. Remarkably, she survived and managed to escape, despite Wieniawski not taking her more than 1 kilometer from the abduction site. These incidents occurred not only on the outskirts, but also near his residence on Mamen Sibiryak Street, where he kidnapped 2 children. The final victim, 4-year-old Taisia Morozov, met a gruesome end. Following her murder, Wieniawski discarded her body in a cesspool and placed her clothing in the front garden of an apartment building, hoping that investigators would search there for her remains. The victims who were subjected to Wieniawski's attacks and thrown into cesspools had minimal chances of escape, even if they were still alive. However, 4-year-old Raya Ramatulina, whom Wieniawski had thrown into a cesspool, miraculously regained consciousness and began to cry out, alerting passers-by who came to her rescue. The investigation into the abductions of children in Sverdlovsk posed numerous challenges for the local criminal investigation department. The kidnappings exhibited considerable variation, occurring in different locations and with distinct methods of disposing of the victims' bodies. Furthermore, surviving children were unable to provide clear descriptions of their abductor, complicating the efforts to identify the perpetrator. Adding to the complexity, some parents of victims did not report the incidents to the police. Investigators also grappled with erroneous assumptions about the murderer's identity. There was a widespread belief that the killer had a prior conviction, likely related to crimes against personal integrity. It was presumed that the perpetrator was a young adult, aged between 20 and 25, who appeared youthful or like a teenager. Some even speculated that the killer might have had mental health issues or was a degenerate. It wasn't until the summer of 1939 that all the known cases were finally linked together. However, it was determined that the attacks in Nizhny Tagil and Kushva were not connected to the Sverdlovsk murders. In 1939, Sverdlovsk saw the deployment of covert police patrols, with over 300 individuals arrested in the efforts to apprehend the perpetrator. A turning point in the investigation occurred on October 24, 1939, when 3 police high school cadets named Popov, Angelov, and Krylov made a crucial discovery. While patrolling near a tram stop in Verkhnaya Pishma, they observed a tall man carrying a young boy into the forest. This man was Vladimir Vinichevsky, and he had abducted 3-year-old Vyacheslav Volkov, who had been momentarily left at the entrance of his family's home by his mother. Vinichevsky swiftly seized the child and attempted to flee on a tram to evade his pursuers. The cadets, however, remained vigilant and followed Vinichevsky. They apprehended him just as he was choking young Vyacheslav. Thanks to the scarf around the child's neck, Vinichevsky had to unbutton his shirt to strangle the boy, leaving visible marks on his fingernails. This evidence left no room for alternative explanations or justifications of his actions. Following Vinichevsky's confession during the investigation, his parents, on November 1, 1939, publicly disowned him through an announcement in the regional newspaper, the Ural Worker, demanding the ultimate punishment, execution by shooting. The trial of Vinichevsky occurred under the backdrop of Soviet legislation that permitted the death penalty for minors above the age of 12. This law was introduced after a proposal by the People's Commissar for Defense, Kliment Voroshilov, in response to rising child crime rates. Despite questions about its humanity, Joseph Stalin defended the law as having a pedagogical purpose, to deter both young offenders and those who organized delinquency among children. On January 16, 1940, Vinichevsky was sentenced to death by the Soviet court. He sought clemency, expressing a willingness to prove himself in battle and serve as a tanker during the ongoing Soviet-Finnish War. However, his plea for mercy was denied, and he was executed. In the Soviet Union, the bodies of executed individuals were not returned to their families for burial. Instead, they were interred in clandestine, undisclosed locations. It is believed that Vladimir Georgievich Vinichevsky was laid to rest approximately 12 kilometers from the Moscow tract. This burial site stands as the sole known resting place in the Sverdlovsk region, where the executed were buried during the 1930s. Notably, individuals executed for various reasons, including political and criminal charges like Vinichevsky, were all interred in a single mass grave without distinction. In the 1990s, this burial ground was transformed into a memorial complex dedicated to the victims of repression spanning from the 1920s to the 1950s. On November 20th, 2017, a poignant monument titled Masks of Sorrow, Europe-Asia, was unveiled at this complex. This striking work of art was created by Ernst Neizvestny, a friend of Vinichevsky. As for Vinichevsky's case records, they are housed under case No. 434. The State Archives of the Sverdlovsk region hold 4 volumes of the criminal case against Vladimir Georgievich Vinichevsky, which was adjudicated by the Sverdlovsk Regional Court in 1940. These volumes are stored in the archives collection under Fund R148, titled Sverdlovsk Regional Court, Inventory 2. In 2017, a media report claimed that Vinichevsky's case had been kept classified for over 7 decades. However, the State Archives of the Sverdlovsk region refuted this assertion on March 16, 2018, confirming that Vinichevsky's case had been archived since 1991 and had been accessible to the public since then. In January 2018, A. Rakitin authored a 2-volume book dedicated to Vinichevsky, titled The Uals Monster, Chronicle of the Exposure of the Most Mysterious Serial Killer of the Soviet Union. In this publication, the author introduced a theory suggesting that Vinichevsky may have had an accomplice in his heinous crimes. When you hear about cases like this, and when you read about cases like this, you cannot help but feel a sense of disgust for the perpetrators, experiencing both anger and sadness simultaneously. Every case is a tragic one, but cases that involve young children like this just hit differently. They deserve to have their stories told so they don't end up lost among case files on some shelves in basements. Gerta Grebanova, Borya Titov, Kate Lobanova, Lida Serena, Valya Kamaeva, Alya Gubina, Taisai Romazov, Nina Pleshchayeva. These are some of the victims' names, either meeting their tragic end or surviving encounters with the monster. Let's not forget the victims. Thank you all who stick to the end of the video. If you have any thoughts, please share with me in the comments down below. Click a like if you like this video, and let me know if you have any more interesting cases like this. I want to give a big shout out to I am Adams who recommended this case in the comments section. Thank you. I am Alex, and this is Conundrum. Stay curious and stay safe. Donald Henry Pee Wee Gaskins Jr. was an American serial killer and sexual offender from South Carolina who stabbed, shot, drowned, and poisoned more than a dozen people. Before his convictions for murder, Gaskins had a long history of criminal activities resulting in prison sentences for assault, burglary, and statutory sexual assault. His last arrest was for contributing to the delinquency of a minor 13-year-old Kim Gaskins, who had gone missing in September 1975. During their search for the missing girl, police discovered 8 bodies buried in shallow graves near Gaskins' home in Prospect, South Carolina. In May 1976, a Florence County jury found Gaskins guilty for the murder of one of the 8 victims, Dennis Bellamy, and sentenced him to death by the electric chair. That death sentence was overturned by the South Carolina Supreme Court in February 1978. And rather than face a new trial, Gaskins pled guilty to the murders of Bellamy and 8 other friends and associates. He was given 10 concurrent life sentences to be served at Central Correctional Institution, CCI prison in Columbia, South Carolina. While at CCI, Gaskins brutally murdered Rudolph Tyner, a fellow inmate on death row, using C4 explosive. After his conviction for killing Tyner, he received his second death sentence, which was administered in September 1991. Just before his execution, Gaskins said he killed 110 people, but these statements have been discredited by law enforcement and journalists who allege this was his attempt to gain notoriety. In his sworn testimony as part of a plea agreement to avoid trial for the murder of John Henry Knight, Gaskins was confirmed to have killed 13 people between 1970 and 1975. Of the 15 people total that he murdered during his lifetime, 10 were under age 25 and 6 were teenagers. Donald Henry Gaskins had a troubled early life in Florence County, South Carolina, marked by neglect from his mother and abuse by a male relative. Due to his small stature, he earned the nickname Pee Wee. As an adult, he stood at approximately 5 feet 4 inch or 1.63 meters to 5 feet 5 inch or 1.65 meters and weighed around 130 pounds or 59 kilograms. Gaskins' mother showed little interest in him, and he only learned his given name, Donald, when it was mentioned in his first court appearance. He developed a reputation as a skilled manipulator and con artist, often described as street smart and possessing a sharp sense of humor. In his youth, Gaskins drank kerosene at the age of 1, leading to convulsions until the age of 3. During adolescence, he engaged in a violent crime spree with a group of delinquents, involving burglaries, assaults, and a gang assault. At 13, he was convicted of assaulting a young woman by striking her with an axe during a break-in at her family's home, resulting in a 5-year sentence at the South Carolina Industrial School for White Boys in Florence. There, he suffered sexual assault by fellow inmates. After escaping from the reform school, marrying, and voluntarily returning to serve his sentence, Gaskins was released in 1951 at the age of 18. He briefly worked on a tobacco plantation until his 1953 arrest for attacking a teenage girl with a hammer following an alleged insult. He received a 6-year prison sentence at the South Carolina Penitentiary. During his time there, Gaskins gained respect by killing Hazel Brazel, a feared inmate, claiming self-defense. This led to an additional 3-year sentence for involuntary manslaughter, but Gaskins transitioned from being a victim to an aggressor. He escaped from prison in 1955, hiding in the back of a garbage truck, and later worked with a traveling carnival in Florida, before rearrest and parole in August 1961. Upon his release, Gaskins returned to a life of burglaries and selling stolen property. 2 years after his parole, he was arrested for sexual assault on a 12-year-old girl, but fled while awaiting sentencing. He was eventually rearrested in Georgia and sentenced to 8 years in prison before being paroled once again in November 1968. After his release, he relocated to Sumter, South Carolina, and began working with a roofing company. Gaskins committed a series of heinous acts over the years. His first known non-prison-related victim was a female hitchhiker whom he assaulted and killed in September 1969, disposing of her body in a swamp. Gaskins later claimed that he tortured and mutilated several individuals, both men and women, purely for his pleasure, dubbing them coastal kills. These acts occurred approximately once every 6 weeks as he roamed the American South's coastal highways, seeking to quell his unsettling urges. He used various methods such as stabbing, suffocation, mutilation, and even cannibalism on some of his victims. Gaskins claimed to have killed 80 to 90 such victims, although these statements remain unverified. He mentioned specific instances, including the murders of an African-American couple named Eddie and Bertie Brown in 1972, and a man named Horace Jones in 1974. Despite Gaskins' claims, there is no evidence to support most of his statements about these murders. However, his confirmed victims include: in November 1970, Gaskins killed his niece, Janice Kirby, and her friend Patricia Ann Alsbrook, possibly due to drug-related issues or attempted sexual assault. In 1971 or 1972, he claimed to have poisoned Martha Ann Dix Jr., also known as Clyde, for various reasons, although her remains were lost. In June 1973, Gaskins raped and drowned Doreen Hope Dempsey and her 2-year-old daughter, Robin Michelle Dempsey, driven by racial prejudice. In June 1974, he shot and stabbed Johnny Sellers and Jessie Ruth Judy, as Sellers posed a threat to expose Gaskins' involvement in an auto theft ring, and Judy could have revealed his criminal activities. In February 1975, Gaskins murdered Silas Barnwell Yates, allegedly in a murder-for-hire scheme, and in April 1975, he killed Diane Bellamy Neely and her boyfriend Avery Leroy Howard, with motives linked to threats of exposing his misconduct. Kim Gelkins, age 13, was stabbed to death in an attempt to silence her regarding her abduction and sexual abuse. On October 10, 1975, Gaskins shot Dennis Bellamy and John Henry Knight in the back of the head to prevent them from disclosing his crimes. In 1982, Gaskins was involved in the murder of Rudolph Tyner, who was on death row, following a double murder in 1978. This act was orchestrated by another individual, Tony Chemo, who hired Gaskins to carry it out using explosives. Please note that Gaskins' claims about additional murders have not been substantiated, and his actions reveal a history of extreme violence and cruelty. Donald Henry Gaskins faced his ultimate downfall when he was arrested on November 14, 1975. His criminal associate, Walter Neely, came forward to the police with crucial information. Neely confessed that he knew about Gaskins' involvement in the murders of Dennis Bellamy, aged 28, and Johnny Knight, aged 15. Shockingly, Neely disclosed that Gaskins had confided in him about multiple killings, involving people who had been listed as missing over the previous 5 years. Gaskins had even revealed the burial locations of these victims. On December 4, 1975, Neely assisted law enforcement in locating the gruesome evidence. They uncovered the remains of 8 victims buried near Gaskins' residence in Prospect, South Carolina. Gaskins faced trial for one murder on May 24, 1976, and was swiftly found guilty on May 28. Initially sentenced to death, his punishment was later commuted to life in prison due to changes in South Carolina's capital punishment laws, conforming to U.S. Supreme Court guidelines for death penalty cases in other states. However, Gaskins' brutality didn't end behind bars. On September 2, 1982, he committed another murder within the high-security confines of the South Carolina Correctional Institution. His victim was Rudolph Tyner, a fellow death row inmate who had been convicted of killing an elderly couple during a botched armed robbery. This murder was orchestrated by Tony Chimo, the son of Tyner's victims, who hired Gaskins to carry out the act. Chimo initially faced murder charges, but later pleaded guilty to lesser charges, receiving an 8-year prison sentence before being paroled in 1986. Gaskins attempted to poison Tyner several times before resorting to explosives. He rigged a device, resembling a portable radio, in Tyner's cell, under the pretense of communication between cells. When Tyner followed Gaskins' instructions to hold the speaker to his ear during a specified time, the explosives hidden within it were detonated by Gaskins from his own cell, resulting in Tyner's death. It's worth noting that this case marked a significant moment in South Carolina's history, as it was the first time a white man received a death sentence for the murder of a black man. While on death row, Gaskins claimed responsibility for between 100 and 110 murders, including the shocking murder of Margaret Peg Coutinho, the 13-year-old daughter of South Carolina State Senator James Coutinho, Jr. of Sumter. However, these claims were highly disputed, and no evidence was found to substantiate Gaskins' statements. Ultimately, Donald Henry Gaskins met his end on September 6, 1991, when he was executed in the electric chair at 1:10 a.m. earlier that day. He had attempted to end his own life by slashing his wrists. His final words were, "I'll let my lawyers talk for me. I'm ready to go." Carlos Eduardo Robledo Puig, also known as the Angel of Death and the Black Angel, is an Argentine serial offender. He was convicted of a minimum of 11 homicides, including the murder of at least one accomplice, 1 attempted homicide, 17 robberies, involvement in 1 sexual assault, and 1 attempted sexual assault, 1 case of sexual misconduct, 2 abductions, and 2 thefts. The majority of these incidents took place in the northern region of Greater Buenos Aires. If you like this type of content, consider subscribing to my channel. It only takes a second and you can change your mind later. I appreciate you. New content will be improved and many old videos will be re-uploaded too, or rather say, refurbished. Now let's continue with our video. Carlos Eduardo Robledo Puig, born on January 19, 1952, into a middle-class family, had a challenging upbringing. His parents, Victor Robledo Puig and Josefa Aida Habendak, had diverse backgrounds, with connections to notable historical figures like Dionisio Puig and Martín Miguel de Güemes. Robledo Puig's maternal heritage was German. In 1956, when he was just 4 years old, the family relocated to Borges Street in Olivos, Buenos Aires province. Shy and reserved like his mother, Robledo Puig's early years were marked by their care. He was a devoted football supporter of River Plate and had a talent for piano and the German language. However, his school life was troubled, characterized by thefts from classmates. In 1967, he was expelled for stealing money from the secretary's office. Bullied at school, he had a strained relationship with his father. Tragedy struck his family after his arrest for serial killings, with his grandmother's sudden death and his mother's suicide attempt. His father blamed him for these events, leading to an irreparable rift. Following his capture, Robledo Puig sent a threatening letter to his father, vowing revenge upon his release. His father eventually divorced his mother and faced job loss due to societal backlash. In December 1968, Robledo Puig's criminal journey began when he stole a motorcycle from a bicycle workshop, leading to his first arrest. He admitted to over 14 additional thefts and spent time in a reformatory. In late 1969 or early 1970, he met his accomplice, Jorge Antonio Ibanez. In early 1971, they committed several high-profile robberies, amassing wealth for lavish purchases. However, they were arrested in January 1971, facing serious felony charges. Robledo Puig was briefly released but had to appear in court. He and Ibanez, both on bail, managed to escape to Mar del Plata by train. In a series of horrifying events during the early 1970s, Puig, alongside his accomplice Jorge Antonio Ibanez, left a trail of violence and terror in their wake. Their first recorded murder took place on the 3rd of May 1971, when they entered a Vicente Lopez auto repair shop late at night. Puig fatally shot the shop owner and inflicted severe injuries upon his wife, who was then subjected to a sexual assault by Ibanez. Thankfully, the wife survived, along with her 10-month-old daughter, who narrowly escaped Puig's gunfire. Before fleeing, they made off with 400,000 Argentine dollars in cash. Merely days later, on the 14th of May 1971, Puig and Ibanez targeted an Olivos nightclub, robbing more than 2 million pesos from its storage room. In a chilling twist, Puig discovered 2 sleeping watchmen behind an open door. Without hesitation, he opened fire, claiming both of their lives. On the 24th of May 1971, Puig and Ibanez entered a Vicente Lopez supermarket. Once inside, Puig shot and killed a 61-year-old watchman before absconding with over 5 million pesos. To mark their gruesome success, they celebrated at the crime scene, consuming an entire bottle of whiskey. June 13, 1971, marked a horrific event as Puig and Ibanez kidnapped a 16-year-old girl from a Buenos Aires highway. After forcibly abducting her at gunpoint, Ibanez sexually assaulted the girl, ultimately ordering her out of the car. Puig then instructed the girl to walk away without looking back before heartlessly shooting her 5 times, ending her life. It remains uncertain whether Puig himself was involved in the sexual assault. Another young woman met a tragic fate on the 24th of June 1971, when Puig and Ibanez abducted a 22-year-old near the site of the previous murder. Transporting her to an isolated area, Ibanez attempted sexual assault, and it remains unclear whether Puig participated. Ibanez then forced the woman out of the car, where Puig followed and mercilessly shot her multiple times in the back, extinguishing her life. On the 5th of August 1971, Ibanez, Puig's partner in crime, perished in a baffling car accident while Puig was at the wheel. Subsequent rumors suggested Puig's possible involvement in Ibanez's death, with claims that he staged the accident as an alibi for murder. Following Ibanez's demise, Puig sought out a new accomplice, befriending Hector Somoza. Their criminal partnership commenced on the 15th of November 1971, when they entered a supermarket in the northern Greater Buenos Aires area. However, their criminal act was thwarted by the unexpected presence of a 50-year-old watchman. Puig responded with deadly force, ruthlessly taking the watchman's life. On the 17th of November 1971, Puig and Somoza broke into an auto agency, making off with 90,000 pesos in cash. Before their escape, Puig killed a sleeping watchman who had grown suspicious of a series of watchman deaths in the area, raising police concerns about serial murders. Puig's final murder of 1971 occurred on the 25th of November, when he and Somoza targeted a Dodge agency, absconding with a substantial sum of 1.5 million pesos. Before their getaway, Puig led the watchman to the agency's second floor, where he coldly ended the man's life with 3 consecutive gunshots. The curtain finally fell on Puig's reign of terror on the 3rd of February 1972. In a Tigre, Buenos Aires hardware store, he encountered a watchman whom he locked in a small room at gunpoint. Moments later, Puig returned, opened the door, and fatally shot the man with 2 gunshots. After the murder, Puig and Somoza attempted to crack the safe vault. In a perplexing turn of events, Somoza made a sudden move behind Puig, which Puig interpreted as an attempt on his life. In response, Puig drew his handgun and shot Somoza, ending his life. Puig attempted to obscure Somoza's identity, resorting to disfiguring his face and hands with a blowtorch. Inadvertently, he overlooked the identification card in Somoza's pockets, ultimately sealing his own fate. The reign of terror orchestrated by Carlos Eduardo Robledo Puig concluded when he was arrested on the 4th of February 1972, after his identity card was discovered in Somoza's possession. Aged just 20, Puig's grisly crimes had finally caught up with him. Carlos Eduardo Robledo Puig's trial unfolded more than 8 years after his arrest, commencing on the 4th of August 1980. Puig faced a staggering 36 charges, including 11 counts of aggravated murder. In a bold stance, he shifted blame onto his first accomplice, Ibanez, and openly scorned the entire legal proceedings, dubbing it a farce. Over the course of 4 months, the trial saw 92 witnesses testifying against Puig, accusing him of the heinous crimes. Prior to and during the proceedings, forensic psychiatrist Osvaldo Raffo diagnosed Puig as a psychopath and a menace to society. Puig, who underwent more than 25 evaluations by Raffo, later accused the psychiatrist of lying and capitalizing on his notoriety. The trial reached its climax on the 27th of November 1980, when the 3 presiding judges delivered a unanimous verdict. Robledo Puig received a life sentence with the additional punishment of indeterminate reclusion, the most severe penalty permitted under Argentine law. Following the verdict, Puig addressed the court with a declaration: "This was a Roman circus. I was judged and sentenced beforehand." In the aftermath of the trial, Robledo Puig adamantly denied his involvement in the murders he had been charged with, although he acknowledged his thefts. He claimed that he had been tortured and coerced into confessing. Notably, the sole survivor and eyewitness who did not testify in court cited health reasons. This survivor described her assailant as having long hair, which differed from Puig's short, curly hair. Carlos Eduardo Robledo. Puig's life behind bars has been marked by a series of parole applications and incidents that have kept him in the public eye. In July 2000, Puig became eligible for parole, but chose not to submit a petition for release. On the 7th of July 1973, Puig made a brief escape from prison, only to be recaptured 3 days later in downtown Buenos Aires. During this time, his mother, who vehemently defended him and denied his involvement in the murders, faced scrutiny from the media. When questioned about her son's innocence, she conceded that he had done some things, but not all of them. In 2003, Puig's behavior took an alarming turn as he was briefly transferred to a psychiatric hospital. During his stay, he dressed as Batman and set fire to the prison workshop in Olavarria. After being deemed mentally competent, he was returned to prison. In 2007, he was transferred to another prison in Azul, Buenos Aires. Puig's quest for parole continued in 2008 when he submitted a request for release. However, the reviewing judge denied his parole, deeming him still a threat to society. In November 2013, he made a unique request to have his sentence reviewed or, alternatively, to be executed by lethal injection, despite the fact that the death penalty was not legal in Argentina. The Supreme Court of Justice rejected both requests, with the latter being illegal. Puig's pursuit of parole faced another setback in 2015 when the Supreme Court of Justice rejected an appeal he filed against the decision to deny him parole. His time in prison has been marred by incidents, including intoxication related to medication side effects in May 2019. In March 2023, during an interview, Puig denied his crimes and shifted blame onto others. He expressed a desire to be euthanized and has a history of requesting execution, even though the death penalty is not a legal punishment in Argentina. In June 2023, Judge Oscar Roberto Quintana once again denied his parole request, citing Puig's inconsistent emotions and paranoid reflections. Remarkably, as of 2023, Carlos Eduardo Robledo Puig has spent over 50 years in prison, holding the record as the longest-serving prisoner in South America. Hey guys, in today's Conundrum we will cover the case of Charles Sobraj, born Hachin Panani Gurmukh Sobraj on April 6, 1944, a notorious figure in the 1970s, preying on Western tourists along the South Asian hippie trail. Infamously dubbed the Bikini Killer, due to the clothing worn by some of his victims, he was also known as the Splitting Killer and the Serpent for his uncanny ability to elude authorities. Sobraj's dark legacy includes the suspected murder of at least 20 tourists across South and Southeast Asia, with 14 of these heinous crimes occurring in Thailand. He faced incarceration in India, from 1976 to 1997, only to return to France upon release. In 2003, he ventured to Nepal, where he was arrested, tried, and ultimately sentenced to life behind bars. However, on December 21, 2022, the Supreme Court of Nepal ordered his release due to his advanced age, after serving 19 years of his prison sentence. Just 2 days later, on December 23rd, he was set free and deported to France. Charles Sobraj's tale is one of a handsome, charming, and utterly unscrupulous man who skillfully used his looks and cunning to propel his criminal career, even reveling in his notoriety. His life story has been the focus of numerous biographies, documentaries, a Bollywood film titled Maynard Charles, and the gripping 2021 BBC Netflix drama series, The Serpent. Charles Sobraj's early years were marked by a turbulent upbringing and a penchant for criminal activities. Born on April 6, 1944 in Saigon, he hailed from an Indian father and Vietnamese mother. However, his parents were never married, and his father disavowed him. Raised by his mother's new husband, a French army lieutenant stationed in French Indochina, his name was officially recorded as Charles Gurmukh Sobraj in church records in 1959. But in this new family, he often felt overshadowed by his step-siblings, leading to a life of restlessness. In his teenage years, Sobraj delved into petty crimes, landing his first stint in prison in 1963 for burglary, serving time at Poissy Prison near Paris. Inside prison, he was adept at manipulating officials, even securing privileges like keeping books in his cell. During this period, he crossed paths with Félix Descogne, a well-off young man and prison volunteer, who became enamored with Sobraj. Upon his release, Sobraj moved in with Descogne, alternating between high society in Paris and the criminal underworld. He accumulated wealth through a series of burglaries and scams. It was during this phase that he met Chantal Compagnon, a young Parisian from a conservative background. Despite Sobraj's proposal of marriage and a subsequent arrest for evading police in a stolen vehicle, Chantal remained loyal throughout his sentence. They wed shortly after his release in 1970. By 1970, Sobraj had obtained French citizenship through his mother's Vietnamese heritage. With Compagnon, he left France for Asia, trying to evade the law. They traveled through Eastern Europe, robbing tourists they befriended along the way, eventually arriving in Bombay, Mumbai, where Chantal gave birth to their daughter, Usha. Sobraj continued his criminal exploits, running car theft and smuggling operations while grappling with a gambling addiction. In 1973, Sobraj's criminal career led to his arrest during an armed robbery attempt in New Delhi. Despite an initial escape attempt aided by Compagnon, he was recaptured, only to secure bail money from his father and flee to Kabul. There, they turned to robbing tourists on the hippie trail, but were arrested once more. Sobraj's modus operandi involved feigning illness and drugging guards, enabling his escape. He left Compagnon behind as she yearned to leave their criminal past and return to France, vowing never to see him again. Sobraj then embarked on a 2-year odyssey, using stolen passports to crisscross Eastern Europe and the Middle East. In Istanbul, his younger half-brother Andrei joined him in a life of crime. Together, they engaged in various illegal activities in Turkey and Greece, culminating in their arrest in Athens. An identity switch scheme gone awry led to Sobraj's escape, while Andrei faced an 18-year sentence after being handed over to Turkish authorities by the Greeks. Charles Sobraj's murderous spree was marked by a web of deception and manipulation that spanned multiple countries. On the run, Sobraj maintained his extravagant lifestyle by posing as a gem salesman or drug dealer to win over unsuspecting tourists, whom he ultimately deceived. In India, he crossed paths with Marie-André Leclerc, a Canadian tourist seeking adventure. Dominated by Sobraj, Leclerc became his loyal accomplice, turning a blind eye to his crimes and infidelity with local women. Sobraj had a knack for gathering followers by earning their trust, often helping them out of tricky situations. This included aiding former French policemen, Yannick and Jacques, in recovering passports he had actually stolen. In another instance, he provided shelter to a Frenchman, Dominique Renelot, who he had secretly poisoned. Sobhraj was also joined by Ajay Chowdhury, an Indian accomplice who became his right-hand man. Their criminal journey took a darker turn in 1975, when Sobhraj and Chowdhury committed their first known murders. Victims were often recruited by the duo, and then poisoned. Sobhraj claimed these deaths were accidental overdoses, but investigators believed he killed to protect his secrets. The first victim, Teresa Knowlton, was found drowned in Thailand, wearing a flowered bikini. Months later, forensic evidence confirmed her murder. More murders followed, including that of Vitaly Hakim, a Turkish Jew, and Dutch students Henk Bintanja and Cornelia Hemker. Sobhraj, using poison, manipulated victims to gain their loyalty before their deaths. His earlier victim's girlfriend, Charmaine Carew, was also found dead in a similar swimsuit. Fleeing to Nepal in December 1975, Sobhraj and Leclerc murdered Canadian Laurent Carrière and American Connie Jo Bronzich. They used the victims' passports to avoid detection. Sobhraj's former French companions, discovering evidence linking him to the murders, fled to Paris, suspecting him of serial killings. Sobhraj continued his murderous trail, killing Israeli scholar Avoni Jacob for his passport. He then traveled with Leclerc and Chowdhury, evading authorities. Dutch diplomat Herman Knippenberg, with help from neighbors Nadine and Remy Geers, began building a case against Sobhraj. The trio then moved to Malaysia, where Sobhraj is believed to have murdered Chowdhury. Interpol issued an arrest warrant for Sobhraj, charging him with 4 murders in Thailand. Back in Asia, he formed a new criminal group, using poisoned pills to drug a group of French students in New Delhi. 3 students overpowered Sobhraj and alerted the police, leading to his capture along with his accomplices, Barbara Smith and Mary Ellen Ether. They were all imprisoned in Tihar jail in New Delhi. During his imprisonment in India, Charles Sobhraj maintained a life of intrigue and manipulation. His accomplices, Barbara Smith and Mary Ellen Ether, attempted suicide while awaiting trial. Sobhraj, known for bribing captors and smuggling gems into prison, lived comfortably. He turned his trial into a spectacle, hiring and firing lawyers at will, and even going on a hunger strike. Ultimately, he received a 12-year prison sentence. Marie-André Leclerc was found guilty of drugging the French students, but was later paroled and returned to Canada, where she battled ovarian cancer. She remained adamant about her innocence and reportedly remained loyal to Sobhraj until her death in April 1984 at the age of 38. Sobhraj's ability to bribe prison guards in Tihar reached astonishing levels. He enjoyed a luxurious life behind bars, complete with television and gourmet meals, while befriending both inmates and guards. He granted interviews to Western journalists, including Richard Neville in 1977 and Alan Dawson in 1984. Sobhraj's prison sentence in India was set to end before the 20-year statute of limitations for his crimes in Thailand, which would have led to his extradition and potential execution. To avoid this, in March 1986, he orchestrated a party in prison, drugged the guards and inmates, and escaped. He was apprehended by Inspector Madhukar Zende of the Mumbai Police at Okokero restaurant in Goa, extending his prison term by 10 years, as he had planned. On February 17, 1997, at the age of 52, Sobhraj was released, as many warrants, evidence, and witnesses against him had been lost over the years. With no country willing to extradite him, Indian authorities allowed him to return to France. After retiring to suburban Paris, Charles Sobhraj capitalized on his notoriety, charging hefty sums for interviews and photographs. The rights to a film based on his life fetched over $15 million. In 2003, he made a fateful return to Nepal, one of the few places where he could still face arrest. He was spotted by a journalist and subsequently arrested for the 1975 murder of Connie Jo Bronzich. Much of the evidence against him had been gathered by Dutch diplomat Herman Knippenberg and Interpol. Sobhraj appealed his conviction, alleging he had been sentenced without a fair trial. His wife in France, Chantal Compagnon, filed a case before the European Court of Human Rights against the French government for refusing to assist him. In 2008, Sobraj announced his engagement to a Nepali woman, Nihita Biswas, and claimed he was never convicted of murder, requesting not to be labeled a serial killer. Reports suggested they married in prison during a festival, but Nepalese authorities denied this, stating it was part of a ceremonial event. The Supreme Court of Nepal upheld Sobraj's life sentence for the murder of Connie Jo Bronzic in 2010, along with an additional year for entering Nepal illegally, ordering the seizure of his properties. Sobraj's supposed wife and mother-in-law were charged with contempt of court for their criticism of the verdict. In 2014, Sobraj was convicted of the 1975 murder of Canadian tourist Laurent Carrière and sentenced to 20 years in prison. In 2018, he faced health issues, undergoing open-heart surgeries. Surprisingly, on December 21, 2022, the Supreme Court of Nepal ordered Sobraj's release due to his old age, after serving 19 years of his prison term. He was deported to France and barred from returning to Nepal for at least a decade. Charles Sobraj's criminal exploits have inspired various works of fiction and non-fiction. He has been the subject of 3 non-fiction books, including Serpentine by Thomas Thompson, 1979, The Life and Crimes of Charles Sobraj by Richard Neville and Julie Clark, 1980, and a section titled The Bikini Murders by Noel Barber in the Reader's Digest collection, Great Cases of Interpol, 1982. Neville and Clark's book served as the basis for the 1989 made-for-TV film Shadow of the Cobra. In 2015, the Hindi film Main Are Charles depicted Sobraj's escape from Tihar jail in New Delhi, with initial production involvement from Pooja Bhatt. Additionally, an 8-part BBC miniseries titled The Serpent, starring Tahar Rahim as Sobraj, aired in the UK in January 2021 and later became available for streaming on Netflix in April 2021. Thank you all who stick until the end of the video. I hope you liked it. Write me in the comments down below your thoughts and recommendations for future cases. I am Alex, and this is Conundrum. Stay curious and stay safe.